On the note of trying to continue to promote sort of human rights and political change, here at the Corbell School, I teach a course on human rights and foreign policy. And in fact, I think some of the students in that class are in the audience today, so I think they're here with rapt attention. And one of the questions is, what has been the U.S. position on this incident so far? And is there anything that the U.S. can do or should do to help promote human rights in Mexico or help resolve this case?
The U.S. hasn't been a huge player on this case. They have lent technical assistance to the forensic investigation. The ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Mexico, did say that American law enforcement did participate in the case in the background in terms of helping them with those kinds of things. But the U.S. and at the State Department in Washington, there was occasional statements of this is an awful thing. We really hope that this gets a thorough investigation. But the U.S. hasn't been really front and center on this case. I think the view is it's an internal Mexico matter, but it also speaks to the rather complicated relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, especially on security issues, on crime issues. During the previous President Calderon, Mexico kind of opened the doors to all sorts of U.S. assistance. They even built a quasi-secret base with the CIA and the DEA and the FBI having a very active role in helping with the drug war. When Pena Nieto came in, I think they were shocked and kind of appalled at the level of U.S. Activity on what they considered their sovereign soil. And so the door did not quite close, but it certainly shifted to less overt U.S. involvement in Mexico. There is the sense that if you talk to people in the Mexican administration, the sense that the DEA does everything here, that we'd be helpless without them. If you talk to the DEA, they'll say, well, that's true, they would be helpless without us, and we're the heroes. And so, you get extremes on both sides. But the bottom line is, the U.S. would certainly love to come in and do a lot more, but, Mexico is its own country and has to solve its own problems. They do have a legitimate argument in terms of the drug war, that the demand for drugs is here. Here in Denver. The new marijuana, right? And the guns largely come from the U.S. But at the same time, a lot of these gangs are not just drugs. They're extortion rackets, they're kidnapping rackets, they're doing a lot of domestic crime in Mexico. There is a collusion between politicians and drug cartels, as this Ayotzinapa case has proven. Release is the most vivid example. Mexico can't quite throw up its hands and say, well, this is the U.S. problem. It's really a big domestic problem in Mexico as well.
I also teach a class here on human rights research methods. And in that class, we look a lot about how human rights cases are investigated and reported. And I'd like to ask you, what has been your process of reporting on this story and other stories in Mexico and the region? And especially, how have you dealt with the challenge of covering stories, like the case of the students, where particular actors have very strong incentives to hide the facts of the case? And do you ever feel endangered during this reporting process?
It really is a hard place to do journalism. The transparency really isn't there. You're never quite sure who you're talking to, and what they're telling you has to be taken, I think, a little bit with a grain of salt. In this particular case, this was an unusual environment in that, we were, with the student case, we're in this, basically walking around this crime scene. We're in this town where people were abducted en masse and killed somewhere. And you're talking to people in town who are either part of the problem or afraid of the problem, and don't really want to talk, don't want that exposure. I'll tell you, I'm not really into war stories, but I'll tell you one little incident that was telling of the complexity of the place. A photographer and I went out with this sort of citizen militia that was looking for the graves, looking for where the students are, and acting on tips as to where mass graves are. And so we tagged along with them up a hill near Iguala, which is a town where the students were abducted. And they were with a person that was sort of their local contact that they had confidence in. And he was showing them where these graves were supposedly. And so we found places that looked sketchy, stones that didn't look quite right, and overturned earth. And they were kind of marking them to go back and dig and see if there were remains. And so, to make a long story short, the photographer and I had to get back to town, and so we were escorted back by this guy who was their source. And as we're walking down the hill, he got a call on his cell phone, and he kind of stopped in his tracks because he was being threatened at that moment to not bring people up the hill, that we know who you are, and we know what you're doing, and we're going to take care of you if you keep doing it. And so we all kind of looked at each other, very exposed at this moment, like who's watching us and who's potentially might be doing us harm. And so you never know when you get into those moments. You sort of use your instincts, you sort of take precautions and go with your gut, but you never really know when there might be a dangerous situation. And so the only thing we could do was to get off the hill and get back. We couldn't stand there for the rest of our lives, so we ended up going back to where our car was, thanking this gentleman for leading us back, and then we left. We decided we shouldn't be with him any longer, and he understood. I mean, he had gotten threats before, so he felt like this was one of many threats I've gotten, but we kind of left the scene after that.
Well, as a journalist, how do you conceive of promoting social change in light of your primary role to, quote, report the facts?
I think most journalists, or at least I feel I'm not actively calling myself a promoter of social change, but I like to believe that what we do helps foster social change. I think people take the information and run with it, and use the information that we gather from the field to guide their own activities. But I don't really see myself as an active change agent per se. I'm not a human rights activist, but I do believe that a lot of what we do supports human rights and exposes human rights problems and cases, and that's, to me, how I see my role.
Well, now I'd like to change topics and change over to Cuba. And you've recently been to Cuba and filed a number of excellent stories on Cuba about the rapprochement between the U.S. and Cuba after over 50 years of hostility. And I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a view from sort of the Cuban street, and what is the current view of normal everyday Cubans on this normalization of relations with the U.S., and what do you expect over the next few years in terms of U.S.-Cuba relations, and do you see any surprises that may come down the road?
I think making predictions in Cuba is a real dicey business. And I think if you talk to people at the interest section, which is sort of the embassy, quasi-embassy we have there, they would agree that it's a little difficult to read the Cubans. They don't always show their cards at the moment. However, on the street, I think everyday Cubans are certainly, at the very least, curious about this change and what it potentially could mean. I think it really varies as to whether, I think most people support it, obviously. let's not forget that there are a lot of ties between Cuba and the United States, family ties with Florida and other places. You know, the United States is not an unfamiliar place by any stretch to Cuba. So I think people are hoping that maybe it means more people from the United States coming there. I think there's a lot of hope that it will provoke more economic activity. I think a lot of people on the ground there that I talked to felt it was long overdue, that there was really no reason for hostility or tension between the countries. I think people, and this is where it gets a little tricky, the extent to which people blame the embargo. You know, the government is very, loudly proclaiming that their economic problems are due to the embargo. I think on the ground you get a more diverse point of view. I think people are beginning to question the system and the extent to which the system works or not. In particular, there's a lot of concern among poor Cubans, Cubans of African heritage, who believe that they are being left behind in this new economic drive, in which Cuba is emphasizing more private enterprise, basically. The big problem is they have way too many people working for the state. The state can't support the number of workers who, frankly, I wouldn't say they're no-show jobs, but certainly not very productive jobs. So they're trying to push people off the state roles into private enterprise. But people who have access to cash have an advantage there. And a lot of people with access to cash are getting money from the states. And so they have people who have emigrated to Miami and send money back. And so those people have a leg up over everyday Cubans.
Well, earlier this week you filed a story that talked about some of the sort of, I guess, economic exclusion in a sense of certain sectors of the population as this opening occurs, which is sort of an interesting counterpoint where we think that this opening may actually lead to greater human rights promotion, but in some cases some people may kind of be harmed or left behind by this opening. So I mean, what's your overall sense of the prospects for improved human rights given this political opening?
I think that, and again, as I said, making predictions, 6 months from now I could be walking this all back, but I think that there's a difference between the economic change that Cuba is pushing and human rights as I think the world might understand it. I mean, I don't necessarily think that there's a link between the economic change that they're pushing versus things like freedom of speech and dissent. I don't think that this means an opening for a true opposition to emerge in Cuba. I think the Cuban power apparatus will want to stay in power and will act to stay in power. And I think their early statements have been pretty clear that we don't see this thaw with the United States as changing our system. Our system is our system, like it or not. And their system does not allow for a lot of political dissent. There still is a fair amount of crackdown on freedom of speech. Even a month or so after Obama and Raul Castro announced this détente, a Cuban artist who had been living in New York and other places attempted to stage a performance art piece in the public square in which the plan was to set up a microphone and a podium in Revolutionary Square in Havana and have people speak for 2 minutes about change and what they want to see in Cuba. And the Cuban authorities cracked down on this and did not allow it to go forward, detained her several times before ultimately charging her with causing a public nuisance, essentially, and taking her passport until the case is resolved. So, I mean, I think there are signs that they might welcome, the cash from the United States, but not necessarily as a way to provoke any sort of meaningful political change.
Well, you just told me twice that you don't like making predictions on Cuba, but I'm not going to let that stop me. So I'm just going to barrel right ahead and ask you this question. Do you see any path toward any deeper political change or reform in Cuba? I mean, is this the start of something? Do you see a way that this could happen, or?
Again, you may have heard I don't like making predictions. I find it difficult to say that right now. Like I said, I mean, I don't think Cuba really changes much until the Castros are gone. Both of them. Gone from power, I don't mean gone from Earth necessarily, I mean not in power. Raul has said that he will step down in 2018. There are at least one heir apparent, maybe two or three, depending on how you read the tea leaves. And I think that might be the moment where maybe there's some room for change. But I think they'll tread very carefully. As I said, whether it's Cuba or any other government, most people in power don't like to surrender power willingly. Where there is, abrupt change, it usually comes from some political opposition or dissent, and whether the dissent in Cuba can coalesce around, unite together and coalesce and really drive change. They haven't demonstrated that so far. There was never a Cuba Spring, even though people were wondering, hey, maybe there'll be a Cuba Spring. No. The government manages to find that sweet spot of keeping the system more or less intact, but also edging towards some change to appease whatever dissent might be emerging. They've been masters of it for the past 50 years. So, like I said, what I see is maybe when there isn't a Castro in power, that might crack the door open a little bit more. But I would say probably not until then.
Well, I want to give you a chance to make any kind of final remarks if you want, and if you don't want to make any remarks, I have one last question for you. So,
let's go with the question.
Okay.
I'd be more interested.
Okay. So this is one of the questions that you definitely did not see beforehand, and that is, what book are you going to write after you leave Mexico?
I'm working on a children's story with my kids, so it might be that. It would not probably be on Mexico. I don't know if I have the discipline really to do a book. Like I said back in college, that instant gratification I think is still kind of there. But I actually admire you and other people in the academic world who can plug away for years on a project, seemingly without procrastination, right?
Right.
It's all research. That's why it's taking so long.
No procrastination here.
Yeah, this is great. I don't really know that I have a book pending. But I think of the right subject, and I felt like I should be the one to do it. I'd be open to it, but I don't have a book plan right now.
Thanks. Well, those are all the questions I have. I'd like to open it up to you all to ask your questions. And I'm wondering if maybe, Anthony, could you run with the mics? I think we need to have these people mic'd up so we can hear them and get them on audio. I see a hand right there in the middle. I'll ask that. We do have limited time, so I'll ask people to please keep your questions brief, and if you could also just briefly introduce yourself, that would be great. But I really do appreciate the brief questions.
Hi, my name is Jim Chaney. I'm a retired engineer, school teacher, various other things, and I've been involved with a local group that does work in Guatemala for peace and justice, but I wanted to remain anonymous because I don't represent them. I had two quick questions. One was, I think it might be helpful for folks here to know, those who don't know or aren't aware of it, where those 43 students came from. My understanding is a little bitty town near the west coast, southwest of Mexico City. Is that correct?
They came from various small towns in Guerrero State, near Ayotzinapa, which is heading more towards the Acapulco side of the state.
Which is east or west?
South, actually.
South, yes.
Up in the mountains, maybe probably a 4-hour drive or so from Acapulco, up winding mountain roads. You know, it's a pretty remote spot.
Yeah, and that's not really close to Mexico City.
Close geographically or in a car, depends on how you ask the question. But by car, it's a good 5 hours or so to get to where the school is.
And the only reason I wanted to ask that was to clarify it in terms of how pervasive the problem is throughout Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, we're focusing on the student's case, but there are many other parts of, or I should say several parts of Mexico that are quite troubled. But remember, Mexico is a huge country, so what's going on in one pocket doesn't mean that other areas, that's going on everywhere. There are areas that are quite safe and pretty stable.
Yeah. The other question I had was about the interrelationship between Mexico and Cuba. At one time, Mexico was seen as a possible conduit for normalizing relations, but now because their situation is so chaotic in terms of crime and drugs, etc. I get feedback from Pastors for Peace, for Hands Off Cuba, folks that this could be, Cuba's really reticent to let Mexico have any hand in this, even though I know Pastors for Peace send their aid through Mexico, because it's very difficult to send it through the U.S., through Miami. So would you want to comment on like the history of that relationship and where it is now?
Well, yeah, Mexico and Cuba have had, you mentioned a book, that could easily be a book. They're essentially neighbors. I mean, that they're separated by, the Caribbean Sea, but there's long been a link, Mexico-Cuba link, particularly in Veracruz State on the Pacific coast of Mexico. Not Pacific, on the Caribbean coast of Mexico. Mexico and Cuba went through a real cold period during the Pan presidency of both Fox and Calderon, but particularly under Fox, where he treated Fidel Castro quite rudely at a summit, and they were very much hardline, I guess you could say, on the human rights issue in Cuba. So there was kind of a freeze for a good 12 years. Whereas now under Pena Nieto, under the PRI, there is a move to kind of restore and rehabilitate that relationship. Cuba would very much like Mexican business, certainly, as they welcome Spain and Canada and other places to build resorts and build hotels and develop various economic ventures. That's what they're looking for from Mexico. And obviously tourism is huge. Mexican tourism in Cuba is very big. There are direct flights, there's vacation packages galore. One other point on that was interesting to a story I recently did on the interest section, U.S. interest section in Cuba, and the spy games that have been carried out for years and years on both sides. Prior to that, or I guess during that, when the U.S. and Cuba talked behind the scenes, obviously very covertly, some of those discussions the mediators were Mexican diplomats, emissaries from the Mexico president's office under the PRI, the 70 years of the PRI. So there was a role of Mexico being kind of a mediator in this very cold U.S.-Cuba relationship. A couple times American diplomats met at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City with Cuban counterparts to discuss various issues. So Mexico has been a player in the U.S.-Cuba relationship. But in terms of your question now, I think Cuba is mainly looking for Mexican investment in tourism.
Hi, I'm an international studies student here. I was wondering, what was the mayor of Iguala charged with, and what are the possibilities of him actually facing real legal redress for what he and his wife are responsible for, and beyond just the normal charge of homicide, but the fact that state individuals were involved, and also commenting on the judicial corruption at every level.
If I remember correctly, the mayor wasn't charged with murder for the students. He was charged in there was a previous killing of a human rights activist in Iguala in which the story in Iguala is that the mayor himself with a shotgun killed this person. The Mexico prosecutors are looking into the case, I believe charged him in that case, but not for murder for the missing students, the 43 students. He was charged with organized crime related charges in that case, he and his wife. There is some bubbling in the Mexican press that it might be difficult to make the charges stick. Mexico sometimes has a habit of arrest first, ask questions later. It was obviously a big political stain for the administration to have the mayor who had been implicated, be free. There's a huge manhunt for him. He was arrested in Mexico City and taken into custody, and then charges have been developed. The system is a little bit different from the American system, but they do have certain benchmarks to meet to make charges, and that's kind of where it's at. I mean, it's in the early stages of that process, but whether you're going to see a trial or not, I'd be curious myself to see what happens. Very often these cases languish in the system, particularly at the federal level, where people stay jailed for years and years and years without the case substantially moving forward. Mexico, one side point, is changing their system to have a system that I guess would resemble more the American system, where there's an actual oral trial with the prosecutor side standing up making a case, defense side standing up making a case, and a judge making a determination. Right now it's done largely by paper. There's like a lot of legal filings filed, and then the judges review that, and it's very sort of mysterious how the cases are resolved. But they're trying to make it more transparent and move towards a system where anyone can go see the trial and determine, was it fair or not.
Hi, Caroline Gaines. I'm a Master of Arts candidate. I was hoping you could speak to President Pena Nieto's, forgive my pronunciation, the remainder of his 6-year term. I've heard several reports that given these various scandals over the last several months, that his power has dramatically reduced, and that they're suggesting that the rest of his term might be somewhat ineffectual. And I wondered, from your vantage point, what you felt about that.
Well, he's certainly in a political dark spot right now. I wouldn't say it can't get any worse, because when you say that in Mexico, something gets worse. But it's a pretty, his approval ratings, let's put it that way, are the lowest in like decades, in years, like 20 years or something. So I mean, he doesn't have a lot of public support right now. But I want to emphasize right now, he's got a 6-year term. He's coming up on the middle, I guess the end of this year would be roughly the middle mark. A lot can change, a lot can happen. One telling thing is there's midterm elections coming up in Mexico in the summer, and that will be kind of a test of how damaged he and the PRI really are. People are watching that to see. I know that his administration is carefully watching that to see. But a lot of people believe that one of the problems is that he's kind of in a bubble, that maybe they don't recognize the problem or see whatever the people see as the problem. So, for instance, you referenced his own political troubles with his house, I think is what you're referring to. Quick background, as the missing students case was transpiring, a separate big political scandal was erupting over the First Lady's acquisition of a house from a big government contractor. And she supposedly was paying it back on credit, but it kind of raised a big ruckus, and it was discovered that not only did she have a house from the contractor, but so did the finance minister, and ultimately so did the president. And it caused a huge eruption among the good government groups. But again, people were kind of waiting to see, well, I mean, does this provoke change? Does this, really rattle the cages to get real meaningful anti-corruption moving forward, and so far I would have to say probably not. But it did severely wound him politically. And I think it remains to be seen what they do to kind of regather themselves. As I said today, the Attorney General stepping down, that's I think a sign that they're trying to move forward. People have been calling for his head for months, and now finally he's stepping down. So maybe this is the beginning of something, some concrete steps towards regrouping and kind of moving forward. But how they move forward and what exactly they do, I think remains to be seen.
Hi, I'm a parent of a student here at University of Denver and have worked in Latin America for many years in the book business. But I have a question and a comment. I was intrigued by the New York Times uncovering the money behind a lot of these luxury apartments in New York City, principally the former governor of Oaxaca. And Oaxaca happens to be one of the poorest states in Mexico. And it wasn't just $1 million, it was millions, and all these shady companies that he set up. I'm wondering if the New York Times, and specifically you, have any interest in following the money in Mexico, looking at Yucatan and saying, why is all this happening there, and why is it protected? And I know if you don't, there may be security issues that might be around that, and particularly for you and your family. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe address that.
I think you should take that story as a sign that it's something that we're very interested in. I mean, I can't really speak about stories in progress, what we're working on. I mean, competitors, you know, might be listening, or worse, targets maybe. But suffice to say that yes, I mean that is a topic of interest for us, and I think for media in Mexico, which is starting to get, I think, a little bit more aggressive about that. I mean, they're not anywhere near where a lot of us would like them to be in terms of, you know, looking under the stone and tracing the money. But I think that there are some investigative efforts that are getting underway. I mentioned this house scandal that was uncovered by an online investigative group in Mexico, which, you know, was really kind of unheard of for such a thing. You would probably not see that from some of the mainstream papers in Mexico City. So I think that the way that journalism is changing, these new online independent outfits, might mean you might see more of that. But the New York Times itself has long considered itself an international paper. We're pushing very hard around the world. Maybe some of you have noticed, I hope, that we're publishing more articles in Spanish online. That's the early piece of what we hope will be an ambitious Spanish language effort. Still being worked out. I can't talk a lot about it, but we're hoping we'll see more of that. And that, of course, means that we'll be doing more coverage in those areas. Yes, is, I guess, the simple way to answer your question.
Hi, my name is Miranda. I'm an international security student. And my question is a follow-up to what you said about the Cuban perspective on the streets. Polling in the U.S. typically indicates that Cuban Americans are very split on the issue of normalizing relations. Did you notice any such thing amongst the Cuban people?
The Cuban people that I talked to, I mean, I wasn't doing a scientific survey by any stretch. I was walking the streets and having conversations. If that's a valuable thing, I think I didn't really encounter anyone who was opposed. One interesting little anecdote, when I was reporting the inequality story, I was in this very poor neighborhood, and one of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution captains, the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution used to be the main kind of neighborhood spy group, basically. They were reporting on their neighbors, any sort of anti or counter-revolutionary activity in their eyes. So they were once quite feared. Now, they still do that to a certain extent, but they're seen kind of like the neighborhood block groups here in the States. You know, they report in, you know, difficulties in the neighborhood and so forth. But I was talking to the captain in this neighborhood, and she, I was expecting that she was either gonna report us to the police or something, or try to get us to leave the neighborhood in some way. But she was curious what we were doing, and then she actually opened up and kind of talked about her own problems, and she had this bandana on that was an American flag bandana. And so I asked her, I said, I'm curious about your bandana. I mean, I wasn't expecting you to wear that. And she's like, oh yeah, I love the U.S. And people, I think, have a strong association, as I said before, with the U.S. Whether it's pop culture, whether it's familial ties. There isn't a hatred of the U.S. That I could detect among the people. I mean, it's really a thing among the governments to a large degree. And like I said, I didn't find anyone who was opposed to normalization. People thought couldn't believe that there weren't normal relations for a country so close and with so many ties.
How much power do you see that the Cuban lobby has in the United States? How much power on our federal government to have this not happen?
I think that's a great question, and they're going to be, I think, put to test. There is some legislation that was recently introduced in Congress, the American Congress, obviously, to either eliminate or severely reduce the embargo. I think that politicians, to a certain degree, are reacting to polls in the U.S. that show the feeling there aren't that hardcore feelings among the widespread U.S. population. I think the recent polls show most people think the embargo is outdated. But whether that means it's going to disappear, I think ultimately it probably will, but it'll probably take a long time. I think this story that is on our website today about the diplomatic talks and Cuba being on the State Department's terror list of states that sponsor terrorism, which is something that really crimps Cuba's ability to do international financial transactions and business, and they really want to be off the list. President Obama himself has suggested they don't belong on the list, but it's under this extensive review. But the Cuban American politicians in Congress are vowing to basically fight any effort to have normal relations with Cuba. Now, how they follow through, whether it's through litigation, if they sue because a company does business with Cuba under the new regulations, and then they follow suit saying that's against the embargo, I think there'll be some legal challenges and legal tests, and I think there'll be some political tests on whatever legislation starts to move through Congress. But they are certainly very vociferous, but I think that there's a mood shifting in the country towards, the embargo hasn't really produced the result that it was originally intended, which was to change the political system. And I think attitudes are softening even among Cuban Americans. The younger generation is not nearly as hardline as some of the older generation, and as Jim was telling me, I think, or it was Chris earlier, there are some even older generation Cubans who are softening their position too. So, time will tell.
Hi, my name is Megan Mashinsky. I am the Ideas Director at the Biennial of the Americas, so thank you for being here. I'm wondering if you can just speak to the climate of journalism in general. What have you sensed in the past 5 years in being in Mexico has changed, if anything? Do you feel it's easier to get to the truth than it was? Do you feel it's safer? If it's changed in any way? And also, just speaking to Cuba since December, I know it's only been 2 months, but same thing, have you felt that it's easier to find transparency, to report, to get to the truth in Cuba as well?
First on Mexico, I think that Mexico has a pretty good transparency law. There are efforts recently to change it that a lot of people are worried might chip away at its effectiveness, but I think it's been one of the better developments in Mexico. I mean, not just New York Times, but obviously local Mexican papers have used that to get good information on government spending and activities. So I think the journalism is generally improving in Mexico, even on the mainstream press. There is more questioning of authority. I think social media has played a huge role in that, in things that might have been swept under the rug are less so these days because there are these alternative outlets to get information out. Sort of a funny example of that that we wrote about last year. There's this very hot restaurant in Mexico City, and everyone's trying to get a table. And so in swept the daughter of the Consumer Protection Agency. And she demanded a choice table and was denied a table of her choosing. And she proceeded to call her daddy's office and have the restaurant shut down. The inspectors came and found some violation and start to shut it down. Well, sure enough, everyone whips out their cameras and starts shooting this and posting this on social media. It erupted on social media, and it had the exact opposite effect. The guy lost his job. They had to fire the guy, even though he didn't authorize the inspection. It became this example of elite Mexican kids who normally would get away with this obnoxious behavior, but people were able to document it instantly what was going on and post it on Twitter, and it became like this is one of the hottest restaurants in Mexico City, and look what they're trying to do. And so it was a scandal. It was one of those 3 or 4 day scandals, but in the end, the consumer protection guy lost his job. So you have to wonder, would that have happened without social media? Would there be even a story in the paper? I don't know. But it's certainly, in a small way, but in a telling way, I think, showed a little bit of the change in Mexico. In terms of Cuba, I think under Raul Castro, people are more open to talking. I was there in 2000 during the Elian Gonzalez saga, and the vibe on the street was quite different, and Fidel was still in power. People were much more wary and cautious of talking, especially to a foreign journalist. I find more recently, my time in Cuba, people are much more willing to talk, and especially since December, I think. Again, these things are hard to measure, but anecdotally, people were telling me things I couldn't imagine that they would have said publicly or to me, 5 or 10 years ago. So I think Raul has allowed a little bit of questioning of problems. And I think in a speech or two, as he even said, we need to kind of question when there's a problem. We shouldn't clamp down so much. But again, it's not like any other country. It's not like walking down the streets of Denver and doing a man in the street. There are still, you have to take certain precautions, and some people simply are not comfortable talking.
Thanks for coming. This has been delightful. I'm John Parker, and I'm a member of the community. We haven't talked about immigration, so I guess I'd like to see your views on any piece of that. How it's perceived in Mexico, legal or illegal, where we're going legally, your viewpoints. Thank you.
I guess the best way to answer that is how it's perceived in Mexico, since that's where I sit. I think not just Mexico and most of Latin America have been waiting for some big immigration policy change in the U.S. for obviously a long time. That said, you have to understand that the immigration trends are changing too. Most of the people, or certainly a large number of the people now caught at the border, are not from Mexico, they're from Central America. Mexican immigration has slowed considerably over the years, both because of the border crackdown, the economic shifts and winds on the U.S. side and also on the Mexican side. So it's there's definitely, I think, a slowing or a considerable slowing of flow, but Central America is becoming kind of the new immigration question in a lot of ways, because the countries are going through very difficult crime and violence problems with gangs drug trafficking, and economically there's a sense that it's not keeping up and providing people with sufficient jobs so that they don't keep looking north. And interestingly enough, it's kind of an immigration issue for Mexico because obviously people are coming through Mexico. In Mexico, particularly last summer with the child migrant crisis, came under considerable pressure from the United States to do something about their southern border, which is very open. I've been there, and it's shocking to see how little enforcement there is and how easy it is to cross and keep going. So for Mexico, it's becoming sort of their own immigration issue. But I think there was a lot of disappointment when Congress didn't really act. But then when the president exercised his executive authority, I think most people rejoiced that the U.S. was finally moving in some fashion. Whether that holds up in court is sort of a debate now. There's going to be challenges. We'll, I guess, see how legally sound the president's move is ultimately. But I think generally speaking, people are supportive of his action, but also, wondering about this new dilemma of Central American migration and what to do about that.
Okay, we'll have one final question here from the back.
Hi, I'm Kaylee Anderson. I'm a master's student here. I was wondering if you could speak to the current state of drug trade in Mexico. It's been a year since marijuana was legalized here, and other states are starting to follow suit. And I'm wondering if you've seen any that affect the drug trade in Mexico at all.
I guess first what I'd say is, the drug trafficking organizations, for a long time depended on marijuana as sort of a cash crop, an easy cash crop. But, cocaine became big, heroin is still big for them, and more importantly, they're moving into other rackets, extortion, kidnapping. I think, it's almost like squeezing a balloon. So as marijuana maybe decreases in importance for them, other areas start opening up. Meth is very big. Most of the meth is now produced in Mexico. It was many years ago, the infamous meth labs of the Southwest and the Midwest. Much of that meth production shifted to Mexico because the regulation is a lot looser. The chemicals that are needed to produce meth are easier to acquire in Mexico or have been, sort of not enforced the way they're enforced here, where you can't, I guess get Tylenol or something. You have to kind of ask. It's not like readily available now. So again, those trends kind of shift. And so yes, I think there's probably less marijuana cultivation, but there's more methamphetamine and more heroin production to kind of make up for it. And ultimately, when that slows down, they move into something else. And extortion is really huge and generates a lot of income and revenue for them, unfortunately.
Thank you all for coming to this event. Before we thank Randy, I just want to say thank you all for your great questions, and please pay attention to our future events. I hope you can come out for them as well. And also just one more plug, like the Mexican restaurant that Randy mentioned, please follow us on social media. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have a website, so please check that out. And now I'd like to thank Randy Archibold from the New York Times for joining us today. So if you don't join